The desert wind carried secrets across the red sandstone cliffs of Canyon de Chelly, whispering through the ancient ruins of the ancestral Puebloans. Ayana moved like a shadow between the juniper trees, his moccasined feet silent on the rocky ground. At 28, he had learned to read the land like others read books. Every broken twig, every displaced stone told a story. He wasn't supposed to be here. The reservation boundaries were clear, marked by invisible lines that white men drew on paper. But hunger had driven the deer deeper into the canyon, and his people needed meat for the coming winter. His rifle, an old Springfield he'd traded for 3 years ago, rested easy in his weathered hands. The metallic sound reached him before he saw her, a rhythmic clinking that didn't belong in this sacred place. Ayana froze, his dark eyes scanning the rim of the canyon where the sound originated. There, silhouetted against the dying light of afternoon, was a figure that made his breath catch in his throat. A young woman sat chained to a twisted pine tree, her wrists bound with heavy iron shackles that had torn her skin raw. Her dress, once white, was now stained with dust and blood. Her auburn hair hung in matted tangles around a face that might have been beautiful if not for the terror etched into every line. Ayana's jaw tightened. He had seen enough cruelty in his 28 years. The long walk to Bosque Redondo, the soldiers who had torn his people from their ancestral lands, the slow starvation on the reservation. But this was different. This was personal evil, one human being deliberately torturing another. He moved closer, stepping carefully to avoid startling her. When she saw him, her body went rigid with fear. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. Only her eyes spoke, wide, green, and filled with a pain so deep it seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart. "I won't hurt you," he said softly in English, then repeated it in Navajo, though he suspected she understood neither. Language had been beaten out of many at the Indian schools, but he had learned the white man's tongue from a kind missionary who had treated Apache children with respect. The woman shook her head frantically, pressing herself back against the tree. The chains rattled with her movement, and Ayana could see the fresh blood on her wrists where the metal had bitten deep. He set his rifle carefully on the ground and raised his hands, palms open. "Safe," he said, one of the few English words he was certain of. "You are safe." Her eyes followed his every movement as he approached. When he was close enough to see the individual tears on her cheeks, he knelt slowly and drew his hunting knife. The woman's breathing became rapid and shallow, but she couldn't move away. Without a word, Ayana placed the blade against the chain, connecting her wrists. The metal was thick, designed to hold, but his knife was sharp, and his hands were strong. It took several minutes of careful work, the woman watching in silence, before the first link gave way with a sharp crack. Her hands fell free, and she immediately brought them to her chest, staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not gratitude exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of one wounded soul, seeing another. "Can you walk?" he asked, gesturing to her feet. The ankle shackles remained, but they were connected by a longer chain that would allow movement. She nodded once, tentatively, then tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and Ayana caught her before she could fall. She was lighter than she should have been, her body speaking of days without proper food or water. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. Night in the desert was dangerous for many reasons, but especially for two people who weren't supposed to be here, an Apache man off the reservation and a white woman in chains. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had done this, they might come looking. "We need to go," he said, supporting her weight as she found her balance. "Can't stay here." She looked at him with those green eyes, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she simply nodded and took a step forward, then another. The ankle chains made her gait awkward, but she was determined. As they made their way down the canyon path, Ayana found himself stealing glances at her profile. She was young, maybe 20 or 21, with skin that had been fair before the desert sun marked it. But it was her silence that intrigued him most. Not the silence of fear or shock, but something deeper, something that reminded him of his own carefully guarded thoughts. They walked for an hour in the gathering darkness, following a path only Ayana could see. The woman, he realized he didn't even know her name, kept pace despite her injuries and the awkward chains. She had strength, this one, strength that had kept her alive through whatever hell she had endured. Finally, they reached a small cave hidden behind a curtain of rock and shadow. Ayana had used it before during hunting trips, and it was stocked with basic supplies, blankets, dried meat, a water skin. "Rest here tonight," he said, helping her sit on a flat stone that served as a seat. "Tomorrow, we figure out what to do." She looked at him in the flickering light of the small fire he built, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tight. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the look of someone who had given up hope and suddenly found it again in the most unexpected place. That night, as she slept fitfully on the blanket he had given her, Ayana sat watch by the cave entrance. He should take her to the nearest town, turn her over to the sheriff or the army. That was the safe thing, the logical thing. But something about the way she had looked at him, the way she had trusted him enough to follow him into the darkness, made him think that perhaps they were both exactly where they needed to be. The desert wind continued its ancient song, but now it seemed to carry a different message, not secrets this time, but possibilities. Dawn came slowly to the canyon, light creeping across the sandstone walls like honey on bread. Ayana had dozed fitfully against the cave wall, his rifle across his knees, starting awake at every small sound. The woman, he still had no name for her, had slept deeply, exhaustion finally claiming her after what must have been days of terror. She woke as the first sunbeam touched her face, and for a moment confusion clouded her features. Then memory returned, and her hand went instinctively to her throat, then to her wrists, where angry red marks still circled the skin. Ayana was tending a small fire, warming water in a battered tin cup. He glanced at her, noting the way she immediately looked toward the cave entrance, calculating distances and escape routes. Smart. She was learning to think like prey, which meant she had a chance of staying alive. "Water," he said simply, offering her the cup. She hesitated for a long moment before accepting it, her fingers careful not to touch his. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but she drank it all. When she was finished, she touched her throat and shook her head. The gesture was small, but clear. She couldn't speak. Ayana nodded. Born that way, or made that way. She held up two fingers, then pointed to herself and made a cutting motion across her throat. Not born mute, then. Made mute. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he had to look away for a moment to control his expression. "Who?" he asked, when he trusted his voice again. Her face went pale, and she wrapped her arms around herself. She pointed toward the east, where the canyon opened onto the vast desert. Beyond that lay settlements, ranches, the kind of places where men could do terrible things to women and face no consequences if they chose their victims carefully. "We need to get those off you," Ayana said, gesturing to the ankle chains. "But not here. Too exposed." She nodded, understanding even though they shared no common language beyond gestures and basic English words. Communication, he was beginning to realize, went far deeper than words. They broke camp quickly, Ayana erasing all signs of their presence with practiced efficiency. The woman watched his movements carefully, learning. Good. She was adapting, thinking ahead. The journey deeper into the canyon took most of the morning. Ayana chose paths known only to his people, routes that avoided the main trails where cavalry patrols might pass. The woman kept pace despite the chains, though he could see the effort it cost her. They stopped to rest when the sun was directly overhead, seeking shade beneath an overhang of red rock. The woman sat gratefully, and Ayana noticed how she positioned herself, back to the wall, facing the approaches, her body tense and ready to move. She was learning the habits that kept people alive in dangerous places. He offered her dried meat and hardtack from his pack. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned not to waste food. As she ate, she watched him with those green eyes, and he could almost see her trying to solve the puzzle he represented. After the meal, she touched her chest and mouthed a word. It took him a moment to understand. "Emma," he said, and she nodded, relief flickering across her face. Then she pointed at him, eyebrows raised in question. "Ayana," he replied. "It means eternal blossom in my language." She smiled then, just a small upturn of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. For a moment he could see the woman she had been before fear and pain had marked her. They traveled until the shadows grew long, finally reaching a place Ayana remembered from his childhood, a hidden valley where his grandmother had taken him to gather medicinal plants. A spring fed a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees, and the grass was green and thick. More importantly, it was completely hidden from the outside world. "This is good," he said, more to himself than to her. "Safe here." Emma looked around the valley with wonder, as if she couldn't believe such a peaceful place existed. She walked to the spring and knelt beside it, cupping the clear water in her hands to drink, then splashing some on her face and neck. Ayana unpacked his tools, a small hammer, a chisel, a file he had traded for 2 years ago. The ankle chains were secured with pins that could be driven out if a man had patience and skill. He had both. "This will take time," he told her, gesturing for her to sit on a flat rock beside the water. "Stay still." Emma nodded and extended her leg. Ayana knelt beside her, examining the shackle carefully. The metal was good quality, meant to last. Whoever had put these on her had planned for a long captivity. The work was delicate. One wrong strike could break her ankle. He had to place the chisel precisely against each pin, tap it just hard enough to drive it through without letting the hammer slip. Emma held perfectly still, watching his face as he worked. It took nearly an hour to free the first ankle. When the shackle fell away, Emma stared at her bare foot as if she couldn't believe it was real. The skin beneath was raw and infected, and Ayana made a mental note to gather healing plants from the valley. The second shackle took longer. The pin was bent, probably from Emma's struggles, and he had to work it carefully to avoid injuring her. As he worked, he became aware of her watching him, studying his face with an intensity that made him self-conscious. When the last chain fell away, Emma stood and took a few steps, marveling at the freedom of movement. Then she turned to him, and there were tears in her eyes. She pressed her hands together and bowed her head in a gesture of gratitude so profound it made his throat tight. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and gently touched the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a cavalry saber during a raid 5 years ago. Her touch was light, questioning, not pitying, but understanding. She had scars too, some visible, others hidden deeper. "We all carry marks," he said softly, though he wasn't sure she understood the words. "Yours don't define you." That evening, as they sat by a small fire eating rabbit he had snared, Emma began to tell her story. Not with words, but with gestures, expressions, and sometimes tears. Ayana pieced together fragments. A stagecoach attack, men in masks being taken somewhere against her will. The details were unclear, but the pain was not. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly. He understood. She had shared her story. Now she wanted his. He told her about the long walk, about watching his people forced to march 300 miles to a reservation that was more prison than home, about the children who died along the way, the elders who gave up their food so the young ones might live, about learning to survive in a world that saw his people as obstacles to be removed. As he spoke, Emma listened with the same intensity she had shown while he worked on her chains. She might not understand all his words, but she understood his pain. Pain, it seemed, was a language they both spoke fluently. That night they slept on opposite sides of the fire, but Ayana felt less alone than he had in years. There was something powerful about being truly seen by another person, about having your wounds acknowledged without judgment. For the first time since finding her, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. 3 weeks passed in the hidden valley, like stones skipping across still water, each day similar to the last, yet each one carrying them further from who they had been and closer to who they might become. Emma's wounds healed first. Ayana had gathered the plants his grandmother had taught him about. Purple coneflower for infection, willow bark for pain, aloe for the raw skin where the chains had bitten deep. He made poultices and teas, showing Emma which plants to use and how to prepare them. She learned quickly, her hands becoming steady and sure as she ground herbs between stones. But the deeper wounds, the ones that couldn't be seen, took longer to mend. Emma still woke in the night sometimes, her body rigid with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Ayana would speak softly to her from across the fire, not moving closer unless she gestured for him to, letting his voice anchor her to the present, until the nightmare released its grip. During the days, they developed a language of their own. Emma had found a piece of charcoal from their fire and smooth stones to write on. She couldn't tell him her full story in words, but she could sketch fragments: a stagecoach, men with covered faces, a ranch house with barred windows, a man with cruel eyes and heavy hands. Ayana understood. He had his own sketches he could draw, his own memories of cruelty and captivity. Instead, he showed her beauty, how to read the weather in the shape of clouds, how to identify the tracks different animals left in the soft earth by the spring, how to weave grass into baskets using techniques his people had perfected over centuries. Emma proved to be a quick student. Her fingers, once clumsy with fear, became deft at weaving. She learned to move quietly through the valley, to spot the flash of a bird's wing or the tremor of grass that meant deer were nearby. Sometimes Ayana caught her smiling as she worked, small moments of peace that grew more frequent as the days passed. It was during the 4th week that everything changed. Ayana had gone hunting, following deer tracks to the far end of the valley. He was gone longer than usual, and when he returned at sunset, he found Emma sitting by the spring with her knees drawn up to her chest, her whole body shaking. She pointed toward the mouth of the valley, then made the gesture they had developed for danger, a quick slashing motion across her throat. Someone had been here. Ayana examined the ground carefully. Horse tracks, 2 riders, but they hadn't entered the valley. They had stopped at the entrance, looked around, then moved on. Still, it was enough to shatter the peace they had built. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire long after Ayana had banked it for the night, staring into the glowing coals as if they held answers to questions she couldn't voice. Finally, she picked up her charcoal and began to draw on a flat stone. This sketch was different from the others, more detailed, more deliberate. It showed a man's face, heavy set, with small eyes and a beard that didn't quite hide the cruel set of his mouth. Below the portrait, she wrote a single word in careful letters: Carter. Ayana studied the drawing, memorizing every line. "The one who hurt you." Emma nodded, then pointed to the mouth of the valley again. The message was clear. Carter was looking for her. He wouldn't give up. "We can't stay here," Ayana said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. This valley had become their sanctuary, their healing place. Leaving it felt like abandoning hope itself. Emma stood and walked to where she had been weaving a large basket from prairie grass. She had been working on it for days, and Ayana had wondered what she planned to use it for. Now she dumped out the grass and began packing their few belongings into it with quick, efficient movements. She was ready to leave. More than that, she was ready to fight back. The next morning, they broke camp for the last time. As they prepared to leave the valley, Emma did something that surprised him. She gathered small stones from the spring and arranged them in a pattern on the ground, a spiral that somehow managed to be both simple and profound. "What is it?" Ayana asked. She touched her heart, then the stones, then his heart. A blessing, perhaps, or a promise that what they had found here would travel with them. They left the valley as the sun cleared the canyon walls, following paths that would take them north toward the higher country. Ayana had a plan forming, but it would require trust. From Emma, from his own people, and from himself. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Emma began to sing, not with her voice, which had been stolen from her, but with her body. She hummed wordless melodies, the vibrations coming from deep in her chest, and moved with a rhythm that turned their walking into a kind of dance. Ayana found himself matching her rhythm, and for the first time in weeks he felt something beyond the careful peace they had built in the valley. He felt joy. That evening they camped in a grove of aspen trees, whose leaves whispered secrets in the mountain wind. As Emma prepared their simple meal, Ayana watched her face in the firelight. The haunted look was still there, but it was no longer the only thing he saw. There was determination now, and strength and something else, a growing awareness of her own power. She caught him watching and raised an eyebrow in question. Instead of looking away, Ayana held her gaze. "You're not the same person I found in those chains," he said. She tilted her head, considering this, then picked up her charcoal and wrote on a smooth piece of bark, "Neither are you." It was true. The man who had cut her free 3 weeks ago had been driven by duty and basic human decency. The man sitting across from her now was someone different, someone who had remembered what it felt like to hope. Emma set down the charcoal and looked at him seriously. Then she did something she had never done before. She reached across the fire and took his hand in both of hers. Her palms were calloused now from their weeks of work together, and there were small scars from learning to handle tools and gather plants. But her touch was warm and steady, and when she squeezed his fingers gently, Ayana felt something shift inside his chest. A wall he hadn't even known was there crumbling away. They sat like that until the fire burned down to embers, not speaking, not needing to. The silence between them was no longer empty space to be filled, but a comfortable presence of its own. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey into uncertain country. There would be dangers ahead, choices to make, battles to fight. But tonight, in the grove of whispering aspens, they had found something neither of them had been looking for. They had found each other. The trading post at Cedar Ridge sat at the intersection of 3 territories, like a spider in the center of its web. It was the kind of place where questions weren't asked and answers weren't given, where Apache, Mexican, and white traders could conduct business without the interference of governments or armies. Ayana had been here before, though never with a white woman at his side. Emma had changed in the 2 days since they'd left the aspen grove. The closer they got to civilization, the more she seemed to retreat into herself. But it wasn't the terrified withdrawal he'd seen when he first found her. This was different, a coiling, like a spring being compressed before it released. "This man we're going to see," Ayana explained as they approached the weathered buildings. "His name is Samuel Gray. He trades with everyone, judges no one. If Carter has been through here looking for you, Gray will know." Emma nodded, but her attention was focused on the horses tied outside the main building. She studied each one carefully, and Ayana saw her body tense when she spotted a particular bay gelding with distinctive white markings on its legs. She touched his arm and pointed to the horse, then made the gesture for danger. "You recognize it?" She nodded grimly, then pointed to herself and mimed being lifted onto a horse. This was one of the animals that had carried her to whatever hell she'd escaped from. Ayana felt his jaw tighten. "Carter's here?" Emma held up 2 fingers, then shook her head and held up 3. Not Carter himself, but 3 of his men. They were walking into a trap. Ayana's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Emma caught his wrist. She shook her head firmly, then pointed to herself and made a writing motion. She had a different plan. Inside the trading post, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of leather and coffee. 3 men sat at a table near the back, their conversation dying as Ayanna and Emma entered. Samuel Gray, a bearded mountain of a man with kind eyes, looked up from behind his counter. "Well, I'll be damned," Gray said, his voice carrying equal parts surprise and concern. "Ayanna, what brings you down from the high country?" Before Ayanna could answer, one of the men at the back table stood up. He was tall and lean, with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to look right through a person. "Hold on there, Gray. That woman with him, she matches a description we've been given." Emma stepped forward before Ayanna could react. She moved with purpose now, no longer the terrified creature he'd found in chains. At the counter, she picked up Gray's pen and wrote quickly on a piece of paper. Gray read it, his eyebrows rising. Then he looked at the 3 men and back at Emma. "Gentlemen, I think you need to hear what this lady has to say." "She can't say nothing," the pale-eyed man scoffed. "Word is, she's a mute." Emma wrote again, faster this time, filling the entire sheet. When she was finished, she handed it to Gray and pointed to the 3 men. Gray's expression grew darker as he read. When he finished, he looked at the men with cold eyes. "Says here you boys work for a man named Carter. Says he's been holding women against their will on his ranch. Says some of those women have died." "That's a damn lie," the pale-eyed man snarled, but there was something in his voice that suggested otherwise. Emma was writing again, her hand moving frantically across the paper. This time, when she finished, she walked directly to the 3 men and slammed the paper down on their table. One of them read it aloud, his voice growing quieter with each word. "I know where the bodies are buried. I know which of you helped dig the graves. I know about the other women you're looking for right now. And I know that a federal marshal named William Hayes has been asking questions about missing women in this territory." The silence that followed was profound. Emma had played her hand perfectly, not just revealing what she knew, but making it clear that others knew it too. The pale-eyed man's hand moved toward his gun, but Gray's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't, boys. See, Miss Emma here isn't the only one who's been talking to Marshal Hayes. Seems there's been quite a few young women gone missing from stagecoaches in this area. Federal government is taking a real interest." Emma wrote one more note and handed it to the pale-eyed man directly. He read it, his face going white. "What's it say?" one of his companions asked. Says she'll make a deal. Carter stops looking for her, stops taking women, and she doesn't tell the marshal where to find the evidence she's hidden. And if he doesn't agree?" Emma smiled for the first time since entering the trading post. It wasn't a pleasant expression. She took the paper back and wrote one final line, then showed it to all 3 men. Gray read it aloud. "Then I'll find my voice, and I'll use it to see him hang." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to handle this development. Their missing prey had become a predator. "We need to get back," the pale-eyed man finally said. "Tell Carter what she said." "You do that," Gray agreed pleasantly, "and you tell him that this trading post has always been neutral ground. Anybody comes through here with violence on their mind might find themselves facing more trouble than they bargained for." After the men left, Emma slumped against the counter as if her strength had finally given out. The performance had cost her everything she had, but it had worked. "You've got backbone, girl," Gray said admiringly, "but this ain't over. Carter's not the type to back down easy." Emma wrote quickly, "I know, but now he knows I'm not helpless anymore." That night they camped in the hills above the trading post. Emma sat by their small fire, staring into the flames with an expression Ayanna couldn't read. "You could have told me," he said finally, "about the plan." She looked at him and wrote on a piece of bark, "Would you have let me face them alone?" "No. That's why I didn't tell you." Ayanna studied her profile in the firelight. "This Marshal Hayes, is he real?" Emma's smile was enigmatic. She wrote, "He is now. Gray will make sure of that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear mountain air. Finally, Emma wrote something else and handed it to him. "Thank you for giving me back my strength. I had forgotten I had it." Ayana folded the piece of bark carefully and put it in his pocket. "What will you do now?" Emma considered this for a long time before writing her answer. "Find the other women Carter is hunting. Help them find their strength too. That's dangerous work. So is staying silent." The next morning, they parted ways at the crossroads below Cedar Ridge. Emma was heading east, toward the territories where Marshal Hayes would soon be asking uncomfortable questions. Ayana was going north, back to his people, carrying with him the knowledge that healing was possible even after the worst kinds of wounds. Before she left, Emma gave him something, a small basket woven from grass they had gathered in their hidden valley. Inside was a single smooth stone from the spring where they had found peace together. She wrote one last note. "So you remember that silence can be healing, but it can also be a choice. Sometimes the bravest thing is to speak. Sometimes it's to listen. You taught me the difference." As he watched her ride away, Ayana thought about voices, how they could be stolen, how they could be found, how sometimes the most important conversations happened without words at all. Emma had found her voice again, not in the sounds she could make, but in the strength she chose to use. And in helping her find it, Ayana had discovered something he hadn't known he'd lost. The belief that broken things could be made whole again, that two damaged people could help each other heal, and that love didn't always need words to speak its truth. The desert wind carried her scent away as she disappeared over the horizon. But the memory of her touch, the sound of her silent laughter, the sight of her standing tall and unafraid in front of three armed men, those would stay with him forever. Sometimes, the most powerful voices were the ones that chose their words carefully, that spoke only when they had something worth saying. Emma had taught him that, and in the years to come, when he told the story of the mute woman who found her voice, he would remember that the greatest healing often happened in silence, between two souls who understood that being truly seen was worth more than all the words in the world. The chain she had worn was broken, but the connection they had forged would last a lifetime.